So we are in the book of Ruth, which is probably a better known Old Testament book. It's a shorter book, about 4 chapters, and Ruth called it kind of the jewel of hope because Ruth 1:1 latches on. It tells us the context that it's written in, and it's almost, you could pretty much attach it to the book of Judges, but it says directly in Ruth 1:1, now it came about in the days when judges governed. So I mean, we have the context set for us of last week, what that looks like. It says, and there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went down to sojourn in the land of Moab with his wife and his 2 sons. So already Ruth 1:1 provides a lot of information. But I think just something else that we see here is that sometimes I think people, if they're not as familiar with the Bible, if we're not as familiar with God's Word and what it says about itself, or how it even starts and ends books, sometimes people think it's kind of like this mystery that the Bible is just this kind of floating collection of random books. But we can kind of see the seams, as I've called them, of the books kind of interconnect and build out the next section of the story. So it's not like a mystery of, what books are part of, comprise the Bible, comprise the Old Testament. It's, you have Judges, and then you have Ruth, which is probably written during, I think it's probably written by Samuel. I think Judges, there's some good evidence, is written by Samuel, who is himself a judge, a prophet, and somebody who will be the kingmaker, anointer of kings. And he is the kind of transitionary person who fills in that gap, I think, for us between the conquest, the period of Judges, to the period of kings. And so I think Samuel's a good person to kind of fill in, that history, but also it's history with theology built into it. And so Samuel will kind of follow that pattern of Moses to being that prophet, historian, judge, mediator. But anyway, it's not a hugely important issue to say that Samuel wrote it. Ruth takes place probably between the 1300s and 1100s. David's around 1000 BC, so it's fairly easy to remember. Dies around the 960s, and that's when Solomon takes his reign. We know when the temple is built. We know what year that takes place. We know it's exactly about, I think it's 480 years after the Exodus, and so it lays out that timeline for us pretty nicely. And then also we have at the end of Ruth the kind of family line of leading to David, so it kind of locates Ruth for us in history a few generations back from David. But we also see here, so in the first verses, just to kind of set the tone, remember last week as we talked about Judges, I talked about that, the Judges, we hear about them, and there are more than these 6, but we see Israel going through the 6 sin cycles. We see these kind of 6 major judges that take place, ending, with the kind of one they finally talk about is Samson. But then the book goes on and continues through showing that the people are corrupt during the time period of Judges as well. It's not just the leadership; it's the priests, the Levites, it's the people themselves, and we see that in Judges 17 and 18 with the wandering Levite, who we see from Judges 18:30 may even be a descendant of Moses, that he's participating in building this idol to be a household god and facilitate worship to God through this household idol. And then that idol gets stolen by another tribe wandering off their land that they're not able to hold. And then they go murder a bunch of people, burn down a village, and after stealing this golden idol. So I mean, all this stuff going on, this instability in the land, and then in Judges 19 through 21, which is Israel's Sodom and Gomorrah, where man stays in Jerusalem instead of in the Canaanite area while he's going to retrieve his concubine. And it reads just like Genesis 19, so it's easy to remember. Judges 19 parallels with that. And then the defilement of the land as they divide, as that Levite who left Bethlehem divides up the concubine, mails her out to all the 12 tribes, which a dead body like that defiles the whole land according to the law. And so this people gather to deal with this, and it establishes basically a civil war that's taking place. So Israel is not, they're not having full conquest, and they're not united. They're not a nation to speak of. God has created them as a national people at the Exodus, but they are not a nation united in their land. They're a loose confederacy of tribes, federation of tribes that often fight with each other. And so what you need next is a theology of kings and a king to rule over them, which God has promised as well. So we see this trilogy of Bethlehem where a guy leaves Bethlehem, something bad happens. Another guy leaves Bethlehem, something bad happens. And then Ruth, a guy leaves Bethlehem and something bad happens, but Ruth does turn the situation around to hope. And then I said also that if you understand the book of Deuteronomy, you will understand the book of Ruth, plus other books and concepts in the Old and New Testament. But if you read here, we understand it's when the days judges governed that there is a famine in the land. That's not a random event or an accident of history. A famine in the land where God said that if you obey me, the blessings will be you'll be productive, you'll be fruitful, you won't hunger, you won't have these problems. But if you disobey, or rather almost when you disobey, these will be the curses, and one of them is that God would withhold rain, and there would be the resulting famine. So if we have to understand this not only historically but theologically. The people are not obeying God. There's a famine in the land. And then a guy from Bethlehem leaves, but he leaves understandably leaves his land because there's a famine. However, you're supposed to, in Joshua, the tribes were laid out to occupy a certain area of land, and they could sell or rent it to each other, but it always had to default back to the tribe after a certain period of years and conditions, because God had a plan for each tribe within that land to occupy a certain area. So the fact that it says here, a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the land of Moab, among the pagan Moabites, surrounding himself by a pagan idolatrous culture. And we see that Israel right now is not much better, except for the fact that they do have the truth, but that just means that they're more accountable. He takes his wife, his 2 sons, and then gives us his name. It says the name of the man was Elimelech, which means God is my king. And he said the name of his wife was Naomi, which means sweet or pleasant one, which is going to be ironic through this. Just keep that in mind. And the names of the others were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem in Judah. Now they entered the land of Moab and remained there. And then the Ephrathah is the area of Bethlehem. It's more of like the little sector of Bethlehem, kind of the zip code that's supposed to be the fruitful area where you would grow stuff, but obviously things are not growing there. And so we see problems here that continue from the book of Judges as it zeroes in on this one family. And it says in 1:3, then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. And they took for themselves Moabite women as wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth, and they lived there about 10 years. And so Deuteronomy 7, other passages, Joshua talked about this as well. They were not supposed to intermarry with the pagan Gentiles, not because of race or the fact that they were of a different tribe or things of that nature. It was because they were of a different faith. They worshipped other gods. And God said, they will draw your hearts away from the true God to serve other gods, which doesn't indicate it here, but it may have happened here. And so we get the introduced to Orpah, which I've heard from multiple sources that this is where Oprah's name actually came from, that it was misspelled on the birth certificate is one that I heard this morning, and so she became Oprah instead of Orpah. But anyway, and then Ruth, whose name means friend. And so they lived there about 10 years, and then Naomi, she's a widow but still has sons, a family to take care of her. In 1:5 it says, then both Mahlon and Chilion died. And their names mean basically weak and sickly. Short, small, and wasting, basically, is kind of what it means. So anyway, so they weren't probably very healthy growing up, and then died. We don't know why. So this is pretty rough for Naomi. She is experiencing loss, not only just personal loss, but loss of any caretakers, loss of passing on to any heirs, any inheritance. So she would still be able to have the access to her family farm, but there's no one to pass it on to. And so this is a pretty destitute situation for her. And so then this is kind of where the story moves on. It says, Then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the land of Moab, for she had heard in the land of Moab that Yahweh had visited his people in giving them food. So the famine is over. So they departed from the place where she was, and her two daughters-in-law with her. And they went on their way to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, Go, return to your mother's house. May Yahweh deal kindly with you, as he has dealt with the dead and with me. Okay, let's pause there for a minute. Naomi is going to rename herself, and actually she's going to rename herself Mara, which means bitter. And you actually, if you read this, I hadn't even noticed this until just studying this again recently, until really you get halfway through the book, her statements are pretty bitter. She's actually not very caring toward Ruth. And it sounds kind of nice here, but it says, May Yahweh deal kindly with you as he dealt with the dead and with me. I mean, basically, okay, if that's what God's kindness looks like, look what happened to my husbands, look what happened to my sons, look at the situation I'm in. Yeah, I hope God does, kind of the same for you. Hope good, good luck out there is kind of, but she gives, she's trying to send them back. And to be fair, I mean, she had lost everything. It's not, not that can't empathize with that. And she says in 1:9, May Yahweh grant you that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. So she says, look, these women are still young, still eligible, they could still have children. And so she says this, but Naomi is not in a position to do that. So she's sending them back. And in 1:10, they say, No, but we will surely return with you to your people. But Naomi said, Return, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Return, my daughters. Go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I said I have hope, if I should even have a husband tonight, and also bear sons, would you therefore wait until they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is harder for me than it is for you, for the hand of Yahweh has gone forth against me. So she says, look, even if I got married tonight and somehow had kids and somehow had 2 sons, you'd have to wait until they were old enough to, she said, that's just not going to work. So she says, look, it's harder for me than you. Go home. And Orpah listens in 1:14. But now we get kind of the idea of Ruth's character and her change of loyalty, not just to Naomi, but to Naomi's God. In 1:14 it says, "And they lifted up their voices and wept. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Then she said, 'Behold, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Return after your sister-in-law.' But Ruth said, 'Do not urge me to leave or turn back from following you, for where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God.'" Right? She's switching loyalty like Rahab. She's saying, "I'm abandoning my gods, my people, to switch loyalty to your God, your people." And so he goes on in 17, "Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may Yahweh do to me, and worse, if anything but death parts you and me." And she said, when she saw she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So they came to Bethlehem, and when they had come to Bethlehem, the city was stirred because of the women, and said, "Is this Naomi?" Meaning she's back after over 10 years. And she says, "Do not call me Naomi, pleasant, sweet. Call me Mara, bitter. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, but Yahweh has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since Yahweh has witnessed against me and the Almighty has inflicted me?" So Naomi returned, and with her Ruth the Moabitess, daughter-in-law, who returned from the land of Moab to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. So Naomi has changed her name. She's rebranded. "Don't call me sweet, call me bitter, because God has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, came back empty." Now she still goes back to her estate, their farm, but her and Ruth are going to be very vulnerable in that culture and that time. Two women trying to survive together as widows. But Naomi, we also see, doesn't share full information. She knows she has relatives and family members, but doesn't seem to indicate that, hey, we should actually talk with these people and kind of try to work something out to help us. They go home and just kind of sit there. And so it says in 2:1, this change of scene here into the next kind of act of Ruth says, "Now Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, a man of great wealth of the family of Elimelech, whose name who was Boaz." And so, but she doesn't seem to tell Ruth about this, right? As you'll notice here in the text. And Ruth, the Moabitess, said to Naomi, notice she's the initiator here. She says, "Please let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after one in whose sight I may find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she said, "Well, okay, let me go look for a field. Maybe someone will allow me access onto this field in order to glean," which is as they farm, they allowed certain things to fall on the ground, and they would have the poor of the land, widows, orphans, people like this who were allowed access onto the field to come along behind and gather what was left over. I'll read that passage from Deuteronomy. But notice here that Ruth is initiating. She's going to do this, and she goes, "Maybe I'll find a field where somebody will I'll find favor in their sight. They'll allow me to pick up some food." And Naomi just says, "Okay, go ahead." She doesn't say, "Go here to our relatives, our cousin's house, and ask them, tell them what happened," or she just lets her go. But the providence of God is at work here. Ruth turns one direction, she goes into one field. If she turns to another direction, she goes into Boaz's field. And the text, in an ironic way, makes it seem like it's a matter of chance. It's a matter of luck. But behind the Bible, there is no chance. It's that the Lord is directing these things. So he says, so 2:3, she departed, went and gleaned in a field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the portion of the field belonging to Boaz, who was part of the family of Elimelech. So she happened to, is what the text indicates here, but it's kind of it seems odd that this happened on its own, that the Lord was behind this, that he's directing this. And so she's going to glean again. So this is Deuteronomy informs here, Deuteronomy 24. I'll just look at that for a minute just to understand the law, which is an application of the law not to covet. Is not just not to steal. You couldn't get onto somebody's field and take, and whatever people had to allow access, and to be poor you actually had to be destitute. This is a voluntary charitable welfare system that's for the poor. They're having to go on and gather this stuff. But in Deuteronomy 24 verse 19, it says, "When you reap your harvest in your field and have forgotten a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the alien, for the orphan, for the widow, in order that Yahweh your God may bless you in all your work of your hands. When you beat the olive tree, you shall not go over the boughs again. It shall be for the alien, the orphan, the widow. When you gather grapes from your vineyard, you shall not go over it again. It shall be for the alien, the orphan, the widow. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore, I'm commanding you to do this." So he says, look, you forget some of the stuff you harvested in the field, just leave it. Leave it. Don't be stingy over what God has given you. You go over the grape clusters, the olive clusters. You don't go through every single one. Leave it. Let the poor come and pick at it, get what they can get from it, and God will bless that. Because remember, you were a slave, you were at it hard, and so provide this, allow this for the people of the land. Now, some fields are better than others, and there's no state enforcement of this. There's no guy who comes around and has a clipboard and says, did you make sure that you left X amount of wheat behind? Remember, these people are in covenant in a nation with God. So do you want to be blessed and obey God or not? So some fields probably didn't do this. Boaz's field does. Some fields are dangerous. Some fields exclude access. They're allowed to do, but it's just the idea of, well, God will judge. God will hold you accountable for not for closing your heart against the poor, and so it's up to the individuals whether they do this or not. But to the extent that they do or don't, God is the one who judges and sees all of that, and so holds accountable for those different situations. And so she goes to the field of Boaz, who Naomi presumably didn't tell her about. And 2:4 it says, "Now behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, 'May Yahweh bless you.' And they said to him, 'May Yahweh bless you,' or 'May Yahweh be with you,' and 'May Yahweh bless you.'" Right? So he's a believer. He's opening his field to the poor. He's successful. He's blessed. He's greeting his workers with the name of God, and they're responding to him. So he's leading in all these ways, and which is huge contrast during the time of Judges, where basically everyone's doing what's right in their own eyes. This guy is loving the Lord, following his law, being kind to the poor, and he's having great wealth and success and things that go along with that. And so then Boaz, so now here we get the kind of the change over of the kind of the love story that takes place here. 2:5, "Then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, 'Whose young woman is this?'" So he sees Ruth, she's new, takes notice of her, as the different women would be coming to, either they were part of the family or the servants, or they would be people gleaning like Ruth was. And so he notices her, and the phrasing is important. He just doesn't say, "Who's that?" He asks his servant, "Whose young woman is this?" Meaning, who's her dad? Who is her father? Who's her older brother if her dad's not alive? And in this culture, what he's getting at is, I want to have a conversation with that man because I want to, marry, see if this woman is eligible. I want to see if she's available for marriage. And so, and she would have been wearing, as it indicates later, garments of being a widow and of mourning. And so he would have known probably that her husband isn't alive. But so he wants to inquire about her. But the servant is kind of like, well, hang on a second. In verse 6, it says, the servant in charge of the reapers replied, she is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab. So he's emphasizing, look, she's coming from a pagan land. Are you sure you really want to do this? But now he knows that she is a relative. She is related to Naomi. She's her daughter-in-law, and he probably, has maybe heard that his cousins or whatever, that Elimelech and the two sons have died, and now here's his opportunity to do good to his family, to actually reach out and protect his family through Ruth. And so, which Ruth doesn't at this point know anything about. She doesn't know he's a relative, but she's on his field. And so he goes to her and says in 2:6 and 2:7, and she said, please let me glean. This is what she said when she came onto the field. She said, please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. Thus she came and remained from morning until now. She has been sitting in the house for a while. This is a hot part of the day when they sat under the roof for kind of a break before they started working again. And then as in verse 8, this is Boaz approaches Ruth and said to Ruth, listen carefully, my daughter, do not glean in another field. Furthermore, do not go from this one, but stay here with my maids. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Indeed, I have commanded the servants not to touch you. When you are thirsty, go to the water jars and drink from what the servants draw. So now he says, look, stay here. You don't have to glean. Pick up the sheaves like the other women are doing and take what you need, because now has a duty in his mind to, this is not just a poor person, but this is a family member that he needs to take care of, that he has a responsibility for. And so he tells her to stay there. And the kind of funny thing is the guy who was his servant, this is Ruth the Moabitess. She's from the land of Moab. Are you sure you really want to know whose woman she is, who she belongs to, so you can ask her to marry you, type of thing. He says, and then Ruth is going to go draw water and get it from the servants. So now this guy has just become the water boy, for the Moabite woman on the field. So he's like, oh yeah, watch this.
No good deed goes unpunished.
Well, yeah, no good deed goes unpunished. Yeah. When a man loves a woman, he can do no wrong. Classic. But anyway, so Ruth is profoundly thankful for this. In verse 10 it says, then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your sight, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? Boaz replied to her and said, all that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully reported to me, and how you left your father and mother in the land of your birth and came to a people who you did not previously know. May Yahweh reward your work and your wages be full from Yahweh, the God of Israel, under whose wings you come to seek refuge. It talks a lot about God's wings of protection in the Bible. Particularly Exodus 19, God said, you see how I brought you on eagle's wings, brought you to myself. So you can kind of even see that now Ruth is sheltered under God, kind of like Israel, was worshiping other gods, and God brought them out. He's brought Ruth out as well. And so now he says, look, we're related in this way. And so what you've done, I got the full story. So just the Lord had her get onto this field, right place, right time, right situation, and for Boaz to take interest in her. Is impressed by not only that, okay, she's a pretty lady in his field, he wants to know, who her dad is, but he's actually, her character is impressive to Boaz. And verse 13 says, I have found She said, I found favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me, and you indeed spoken kindly to your maidservant, though I am not like one of your maidservants. Okay, so basically we see Boaz's goodness to Ruth. Just moving on, she gleans until evening, goes home to Naomi, and she's like, where did you get all this stuff? So she finally tells Naomi what is going on, and now we get a positive statement from Naomi. Before, she's kind of like, just go find a field, go get something, and she doesn't tell her where to go, but she ends up going to the right place anyway. And then in verse 20, 2:20, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed of Yahweh, who is not withdrawn in his kindness to the living and to the dead. And Naomi said to her, the man is our relative. He is one of our closest relatives. So it's like, you found a cousin, But he's like, Ruth could have said, well, thanks for telling me. Why weren't we talking to these people earlier? But in 21, Ruth the Moabitess said, furthermore, he said to me, you shall stay close to my servants until they have finished the harvest. Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it is good, my daughter, that you go out with the maids, so that no one will fall upon you in another field. She'll be in a place where she's protected. And then it concludes this chapter talking about, so she stayed close and goes through the barley harvest. Time goes on, lives with her mother-in-law until the later and shorter wheat harvest. Then in chapter 3, kind of the new act of, okay, what will happen relative to Boaz and Ruth and their kind of, their family and Naomi and what's going on here. Naomi finally is seeing, okay, maybe we should utilize this, take kind of what's right in front of us. And in 3:1, Naomi said, her mother-in-law said to her, my daughter, shall I not seek security for you, that it'll be well for you? Now she's focusing on somebody outside of herself. She's focusing on Ruth. She says, now is not Boaz our kinsman, with whose maids you were? Behold, he winnows barley at the threshing floor tonight. Wash yourself and anoint yourself and put on your best clothes and go down to the threshing floor, and do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. It shall be that when he lies down, you shall notice the place where he lies, and you shall go and uncover his feet and lie down and you shall do. Then he will tell you what you shall do. And then Ruth says in 3:5, all that you say that I will do. So what's going on here is Boaz is getting to the point of the harvest where you would winnow, you would thresh, you'd break up the barley and the wheat on the ground and then throw it into the air in this barn or shack where that would blow through the stuff that's not edible, and then the other stuff would fall to the ground. And they would celebrate, they would eat, but they'd also sleep there to guard what they had just spent a lot of hard work producing. And you could use, and probably did in this time, you could use barley and stuff as money. I mean, it's measurable. It has all the attributes of money, as long as people would recognize. So imagine you've just created this whole, big bank account. Somebody could come and steal it. So the men sleep there, they eat. And it's kind of like, Thanksgiving. And so Boaz is doing this. And then Ruth, what she's told to do, she's told to take off her garments of being a widow, of mourning, put on fresh clothes to show she's available for marriage, and go uncover Boaz's feet while he's sleeping, which culturally at the time, he was going to wake up and take notice of her laying there and basically saying, look, okay, we need to have a conversation. Are you, I'm open to marriage is basically the message that she is going to send. I want to kind of rebuild, put the family back together in a sense of after this has happened. Will you act as the kinsman redeemer, which is a concept we'll talk about. So she goes and does this in verse 6. She went down to the threshing floor and did according to all her mother-in-law had commanded her. When Boaz had eaten and drunk and his heart was merry, he went to lie down, heap of grain. She came secretly and uncovered his feet and lay down. It happened in the middle of the night that the man was startled and bent forward, and behold, a woman was lying at his feet. Verse 9, he says, "Who are you?" which is what you say when you wake up and somebody else is there. You're like, what? And she answered, I am Ruth, your maid. So spread your covering over your maid, for you are a redeemer, a close relative. Okay, and so she says, look, you're the one that can act as a redeemer for us. Are you in? And he is. In verse 10, he says, may you be blessed of Yahweh, my daughter. You have shown your last kindness to be better than your first by not going after young men, whether rich or poor. Boaz is probably older. But Ruth now comes and says, you can be the redeemer of our family. Do you want to get married? So Boaz is saying, well, this is great. You could have had a younger man. You could have gone to somebody else and remarried. And so then he says in verse 11, now my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you whatever you ask. For all my people in the city know that you are a woman of excellence. So Ruth's character has been demonstrated now. It says, now here's the problem. A little bit of the drama here. He goes, now it's true, I am a close relative. However, there is one closer than I. So he says, look, if there's another closer relative to Elimelech, to your husband, he would have the first first right to marry you, to be that kinsman redeemer, and to be the heir of Naomi, to take over that family estate, but keep it within that family and that tribe. So if this other guy wants to marry Ruth. So all this kind of seems, a little bit, is just out of place, especially for our culture. But again, it's a concept that comes from Deuteronomy. This was also existing prior to the law in this culture. You can see this in places done rightly and wrongly in Genesis and other places where it's indicated. The idea is there before God says that this is what you could do in the law. But basically the idea is if somebody had a brother who died, who leaves behind wife, kids, estate, you could take over that wife, kids, and estate. But the catch is that you would raise up heirs not for yourself who would carry on your family name. You would raise up heirs who would carry on your brother's family name. So there is a cost you have to give up. And if you have an oldest son in the name of your brother, your will, your property, your estate, all of that defaults now to your brother's name. Your name kind of goes into the background. And so a lot of people don't want to do this or can't do this in certain cases, but this was so that property would stay within certain families, tribes. This is unique somewhat for Israel, but this is the idea that you would take care of that family, but it comes at a cost, but it also comes at a benefit. You inherit and you access all of that, wealth, property, whatever else is involved with that. So in Deuteronomy 25, verse 5 and 6, this is also in the context of an application of the 10th commandment, not to covet, meaning don't be so jealous over your own name that you don't follow through on your duty to your family type of thing is why it's an application of that law. And it says in 25:5, it says, when brothers live together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the deceased shall not be married outside of the family to a strange man. It just means somebody outside of the family, not just a strange man in general. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her to himself as wife to perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. It shall be that the firstborn whom she bears shall assume the name of his dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out of Israel. Okay. Well, what if this is, again, a voluntary thing, more culturally enforced rather than legally required, and some people couldn't do this. In some families, you have one son or something like that. It doesn't always work that way. So there's an exception, 25:7. It says, but if the man does not desire to take his brother's wife, Then his brother's wife shall go up to the gate to the elders and say, My husband's brother refuses to establish a name for his brother in Israel. He is not willing to perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of the city shall summon and speak to him, investigate. And if he persists and says, I do not desire to take her, then his brother's wife shall come to him in the sight of the elders, shall pull the sandal off his foot, spit in his face, and shall declare, thus it is to be done to the man who will not build up his brother's house. In Israel his name shall be called the house of him whose sandal is removed. Okay, so ouch, it's a harsh one. But it's the idea of you would have this public thing of saying, look, this guy will not raise up somebody else's, his brother's family. And very religious Hasidic Jews will still do this. They will, if possible, they will still do Levirate marriage or act as a kinsman redeemer. So they'll marry close relatives in order to raise up a name for their brothers, or if they don't, they still go through this ceremony where they have a shoe that you put on and take off, and the wife has to spit and all this stuff. So, but they still enact this law. Anyway, so Boaz has to go have a conversation with this guy in the gate. Okay, so which is the place of judgment where business, legal decisions, and public contracts and changes of title take place. And so in chapter 4, Boaz goes up to the gate, and notice this guy's name. Okay, 4:1 it says, Boaz goes to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the close relative of whom Boaz spoke was passing by. So he said, Turn aside, friend, and sit down. And he turned aside and sat down. Now I said, notice the name, which was a trick. It was a misdirection, because we don't get his name here, which is going to be a little bit ironic, because we otherwise for this story we would never have heard of Boaz, but we don't know this guy's name, and it'll be important in a second. So he sits down with him and he says, Naomi's come back, that she doesn't have an heir, which is true, and you're the closest one. You can't marry Naomi, but that he would kind of be the heir of the property. And so he's thinking, okay, well, I think I can do that, accept another estate, another farm into my property holdings. And so Boaz says, I'm aware of this in verse 4, so I want to inform you to buy it because it's going to pass to him anyway, so take access to this property. If you will redeem it, but if not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one to redeem it, and I am after you. And he said, I will redeem it. So he says, look, okay, I'll take the estate. But then Boaz announces to him in verse 5, he says, then Boaz said, And the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also acquire Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of the deceased, in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance. So he says, okay, you have to marry Ruth now in order to get this and raise up a name for Elimelech and his family name. And this guy is not, kind of understandably, it's not that he's an evil guy, it's just he has a family. He has a family name that he wants to pass on in property. And in 4:6 he says, I cannot redeem it for myself because I would jeopardize my own inheritance. Redeem it for yourself that you may have my right of redemption, for I cannot redeem it. So he says, look, if I took on Ruth as a wife, I would jeopardize my own name, my own fortune. We don't know if this guy's married or not. There's some question as to whether or not this is, are you allowed to take on a wife if you're already married. There's obviously, that wouldn't be God's intention. However, in the culture of this time, kind of what are the options for widows and things like this. But anyway, it doesn't answer all those things. But for whatever reason, this guy says, look, I can't do it. I've got property to pass down. Maybe he hasn't had a firstborn son yet. Maybe he doesn't have an heir. Or maybe he does have a son. And if he takes on Ruth, the default would go now to any sons he has with her. And so he says, I can't do it. So they have to go through this ritual, this public symbol, and of the removed sandal. And so he transfers the right next publicly among 10 elders or judges to Boaz. Now Boaz is free to marry Ruth. The people witness this. But notice what they say here in 4:11. They say, all the people said, we are witnesses. May Yahweh make the woman who is coming from you like Rachel and Leah, both of who built the house of Israel, and may you achieve wealth in Ephrathah and become famous in Bethlehem. So they give Boaz this blessing for being this type of guy who's going to give up his own name, his own kind of rights, his own inheritance is not going to be the focal point now. He's going to pass it on and raise up family for someone else. So they say, man, this is so amazing. May you be like the kind of first family. May Ruth be like Rachel and Leah, the mothers of the tribes of Israel. May your name become great. And so we've heard of Boaz, this guy who wanted to preserve his own name. His name's not even mentioned in the text. Thousands of years later, we're still reading about Boaz. We know Boaz. We know Ruth. We know David. This guy, it's not that he's a bad guy, but just don't know who he is. Right? So his name did not last, but Boaz's name did. God uses them in a pivotal way. And then notice also who they compare him to. In 4:12, he says, moreover, may your house be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah through the offspring which Yahweh gave to this young woman. Now this goes back to a very sinful chapter in Genesis 38, where this Judah of the 12 tribes, he's has two sons who are evil, and God kills them. And the wife goes to the next husband, God kills him. And he doesn't allow her to have children because he knows he'll have to pass on the inheritance. God kills the second husband. And then she tricks Judah into basically acting as a kinsman redeemer by disguising herself as a prostitute. And when it's discovered she's pregnant, she confronts him with the evidence, say, you're the father. Right? And so, but it's through that family line that Judah does turn, he does repent, he does change. We see him differently in the next chapters of Genesis. But a very sinful situation is what brings about that line, the family line that leads to what we're reading here today. And even Ruth, the Moabites come from Genesis 19, from Lot getting drunk and his daughters getting him drunk and one of them having an incestuous relationship with Lot and giving birth to Moab. And I mean, this is a tribe that's going to grow up as pagan people and enemies of Israel. That's where Ruth and Boaz's families come from, but the Lord works in the midst of these circumstances. And so in verse 13 it says, so Boaz took Ruth, she became his wife, he went into her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive and gave birth to a son. Then Naomi said, blessed is Yahweh, who has not left you without a redeemer today, and may his name become famous in Israel. May also he be a restorer of life and a sustainer of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you is better to you than 7 sons, and has given birth to him. And then Naomi holds the kid. He's named Obed, which means servant. And so she, again, sees the hope in what God has done. And then we get, okay, that's a nice narrative. That is nice to hear among the time of the judges. But the point of this is in the end. It ends with this statement in verse 17. It says, so they named him Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. And then it lays it out again from Judah going forward. And in 4:22 it says, and to Obed was born Jesse, and to Jesse David. In Ruth 4:22, the end of the book. Now we have, here is the right line of the kings. We're going to have David now. And this is, Ruth is mentioned in Matthew 1:5 as one of the progenitors of Christ. So the seed promise is being worked forward here. We have now the right line of the kings established through this family of Boaz. 2 notes I put there: 1 Kings 7:21, 2 Chronicles 3:17. when they build the temple, Solomon builds the temple, one of the pillars is named Boaz. Meaning it's this idea that this is going to be one of those pillars of the family of David, the kingdom that God is going to use to bring the temple and all that that represents, and ultimately lead forward to Christ. We have this kind of fulfillment of hearing about Boaz. We know who he is, but we can see that God is working to get to the right kingly line with David. But ultimately, we know David is not sufficient. What we need is the perfect king, the right king, who is Christ himself, who comes from this family line. So Ruth gives us that jewel of hope in the dark backdrop of Judges. And so, anyway, we got to quit there. So we got to go to church. Anyway, but let me pray for us. Lord God, we thank you that we can see you're working even within an individual family, Lord, to redeem a nation for yourself, working through people like Ruth, like Boaz, like Naomi, others, Lord, even the imperfections, the sins, the things that go on. Lord, that you are working to bring about your plan, to bring about David ultimately to lead, to define what it means to be king, and then to have that fulfilled in Christ, Lord. So we just thank you for just the hope that gives us, that this is not something new, but this is something you've been building to center all history around, Lord. And so we want to orient ourselves around that as well. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you.
Providence of God.
Happy Mother's Day, Michelle.
Thank you.
Just amazing. All the things that well, that just happened.
Right. Yeah.
No.
And she happened to go to this.
If any of you ladies want flowers, there's tons of them outside, just go cut them down.